equipment is working properly. If you've got the time to check, you really need to check to make sure that everything is working properly. Now, in the nursery setting, you never want to give O2 straight from the wall, meaning don't connect anything to your O2 flow meter if the O2 flow meter is not already attached to a blender system. So here's our blender, and I believe it works. Let me see. Here's our blender that just really needs to be plugged into both the air as well as the O2. But it's leaking pretty badly on this side, so I'm going to switch it over to the other side here. And there's no bracket on this side. Yada, yada, yada. All right, it's just going to have to leak for the time being then. So I'm going to connect it to hang on just a second. Okay. All right, so I'm going to make sure that it's connected to both my air and my O2. And now, that way, we're just going to control the FiO2 here. Now, it used to be that you would give these babies 100% oxygen after they were born and they were not improving, cyanotic, or whatever the case may be. But the guidelines have changed, and they found that room air is plenty enough for most babies. But if you have a baby who is, say, under 35 weeks, you may have to go up to 30%. So you would still probably try to start at room air. And then if you had to, you could just move the dial up to 30%. And so again, this way, you're never going to be given 100% oxygen. The only time that you're really going to end up turning this thing all the way up to 100% is if it's definitely one of those situations where you've had to intubate and you're doing chest compressions, and now it's a full-blown type of CPR situation. But in the beginning stages, just start with room air unless you're dealing with a baby who's less than 35 weeks, in which case you may have to go up to 30%. So I'm going to turn this back to 21%. Now, the first thing is always make sure the baby's not too cold after being born. So that's the whole point of this radiant warmer here. This actually works. Let me just make sure it's plugged in. Yeah, it's plugged in over here. So this would be another thing that you would be checking to make sure it's working properly. It should already be on by the time that you get to the delivery room. But if it isn't, they'd expect you to have it on and heating up. So as you see, you can adjust your temperature here, or you could set it here. Baby should be somewhere around 36, 37 degrees. Not too cold, not too hot. If they get too cold, they stop breathing. Now, there should be a temperature probe that you would connect in here and then place on the skin somewhere, so that way the machine or the bed will keep track of how warm or how cold. And if you got it set at this temperature, then as soon as the temperature falls, the heater will kick on and it'll bring them back up to temperature, and then it'll switch off when it needs to. Okay, so I've checked that my blender is working. Gonna pretend that the bed was already on and it was warming up. And now for my O2. So for O2, you've got options. You could use the what's called self-inflating type of resuscitation bag that doesn't need to be connected to any kind of gas source. So because we're only doing 21% in most of these cases anyway, this could work out just fine. You wouldn't even have to connect it to anything. And you're just going to provide your ventilation this way with room air. Now, if you wanted to have a little bit more versatility, then you would have to choose what's called the flow inflating bag, or sometimes they just call these anesthesia bags, because these will be the exact type of bags that you'll see that's connected to the anesthesia cart. So the ventilators that are built into the anesthesiologist cart, it's got a huge one of these things on the side that allows for them to manually ventilate. Now, again, the problem with this is in order to deliver any breaths, it's got to be connected to a gas source. It's got to be. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It can provide what's called blow-by oxygen, meaning that you can connect it and just hold it over the baby's face, and then it'll just give some free flow O2. You can't do that with the self-inflating bag. If you connect this to the O2 flow meter and you hold it above the baby's face, the baby's probably not going to get anything at all, because these are not designed to work that way. But these are. And then you've got another option for ventilating, and that's called, they call it in your textbook, you're going to see them call it a T, like a T adapter. And this is the less sophisticated version of it. In the textbook, they're using the what's called, we used to call them Neopuff, because that was the brand name of it. But it had the ability, it looks like a little box, and you've got two dials that you would use. One would be for your pressure release valve, and the other one would be for like just continuous pressure, which would be like, or for PEEP, essentially. So now with this, you can usually set things a little bit more accurately, meaning that you can be assured that you're not going to use too much pressure when you're providing your breath. Now, with these two, there's a built-in little manometer that you see that's going to measure the pressure. And as you squeeze the bag, you still may not be quite sure of how much pressure that you're generating. So again, with this device, the T adapter, your benefit is that you usually can be able to set the pressure directly. And this can also provide free flow O2, meaning that you don't have to have it touching the baby's face, and it will still provide some O2. Okay. And I know I'm going back and forth. And again, this is one of those things where you really have to be in person to kind of to go back and forth with the equipment. But let's say you wanted to provide just CPAP for the baby, because sometimes you will have to do that. These bags, which are the self-inflating bags, are not designed to provide CPAP. But these are. So the flow inflating bag and, of course, the T adapter device could do that as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm not even going to use this self-inflating bag. I'm just going to, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to just focus on the flow inflating bag as well as this T adapter here. So let me go ahead and connect this. So I'm pretending that I'm now checking my ambu bag to make sure it's working properly. So here we are, just going to connect it to the flow meter that's connected to the blender system. All right, and it's still set at 21%. And then I'm going to switch this on to about 10 liters. All right, so now that my flow is going, notice that the bag isn't inflating fully. It's not supposed to inflate it at all, really, until you make a tight seal. Let me switch positions with this camera here again, so I can free up my hands. And now, so on the side here, this is how we're going to control how much air is going to be leaving and how much air stays. So right now, it sounds like there's a lot of air that is escaping. But to really be able to determine what's going on, you're going to need to cover up the end of the bag here. You can just use your hand and then take your release valve here, this little leak valve, and then adjust it as you need to. And as you're adjusting it, you would want it to read about 5, and that would be the equivalent of 5 a peep. So for each breath that you would deliver, you would just be given about a peep of 5. Now, there's a pop-off valve that's built into this bag here, just in case you get to the point where you're squeezing too hard and the pressures are going well beyond 40, then this pop-off valve is supposed to prevent that extra pressure from going into the lungs. It's supposed to just end up going out the little valve here. So what that would look like is I'm squeezing as hard as I can, yet the needle or the dial here only goes up to 30, which is good because I don't want to exceed that. Now I'm going to pretend that I'm squeezing too hard. And even though it went into the red, the rest of that air just ended up being pushed out through the pop-off valve here. So it's doing its job. It's working like it's supposed to. Could have been better because it could have stopped me right here, but it kind of like went over to about 50-ish or a little bit more before all the extra air ended up just being vented out. Now I'm going to return this back to peep of 5. And then I'm satisfied that this is going to work out. Now, the very first breath that you're going to give, it's probably going to have to be a little bit higher pressure because all of that fetal lung fluid that I was just talking about that was helping to keep the alveoli and keep everything expanded so they can grow properly, that fluid still may be there. So that very first breath is going to take a lot of effort to get those alveoli to open up. And you may have to give pressures up to like maybe 30 or 40, at least for the first breath. And then after those alveoli have now opened, you should be targeting somewhere around 20 to 25. So you keep an eye on your dial here, and as you're giving your 40 to 60 breaths per minute, if that's all you're doing is just giving breaths and no chest compressions, you're just making sure and you're being mindful that the pressure or the needle here is not going much beyond 20. So no more than like 25 for each breath. Now, as far as the mask size, that's also important because you have to have the right size mask for the right size face. If this mask is too small, you're not going to really be able to maintain a proper seal, and you're not going to be able to give effective ventilation. If it's too big, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We only see your arm.
My arm? I can't
Yeah,
really see. How
there you go.
high is this?
Lower.
Is this
Lower.
better?
A little bit lower. Higher. A little bit lower.
I can't. All I see on this thing is a tiny little image of myself about this big, and from that little tiny image, I can see everything. But if you can't see it, I don't know.
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
This here?
Yes.
Okay. So what I was saying about the mask size, you just want to make sure you get the proper size mask that will not be pushing into the baby's eyes because it's too large, or that it's barely covering the mouth itself, or like barely stopping at where the chin is. And it's same by the same measure, we don't want it to be too big, and it's like overlapping, and it's going well beyond the chin, or something like that. So now, if you couldn't see what I was doing earlier, all I was doing earlier was occluding the end of the mask with my other hand here, and I was verifying that this is going to generate at least about a peep of 5 for each breath. And right now, I got to readjust it because it's not quite 5. So I'm turning my dial on the side, this little leak valve here. Oh, that's too much. So it's about ballpark figure. So that looks to be about 5 a peep. And again, each breath that I delivered, I just want to be mindful of how much pressure that's being generated and limit my pressures to no more than 20 to 25 for every breath after that very first breath. Okay, now let me quickly show what this T adapter would look like. So I'm going to switch connections here. So which one of these you use is really going to be probably dependent on you or maybe your facility. Because where I work, we used to have both. We used to take our Neopuff as well as when we get there and when we get there to the delivery room or the OR, they would already have all this other equipment available. So we just kind of take the equipment out of the drawer or wherever it's stored. Or sometimes the OR staff they were nice and they would kind of have everything laid out for us. And we would just have to just jump right in and start making sure everything was working properly. All right, now let me connect this here. All righty. And it's the same thing. I'm going to switch this on. Hopefully this is working. I don't hear anything. Hang on, just give me 1 second here. Okay, it's working. All right. All right, so now the first thing is here's our safety, like to the pop-off valve that I was showing you on the flow inflating bag. This one, the way this one is set up, it's got a low, medium, and high. So somewhere between low and medium would probably be a good safe place. So that way it's going to prevent any extra pressure or excessive pressures from being delivered to the lungs. Anything more, it would end up just being vented out through this device here. Here's again your manometer that's going to show you just how much pressure that's being generated with each breath. And they've color-coded, as you see, with the green and the yellow. And 20 is right there at the end. So between no more than 25 for each breath. The way that you add PEEP with this is you just have to turn the dial. There's you're turning the dial and you press down on this. Some models, you just place your thumb over the little hole here and that'll deliver the breath. This one has got a little spring kind of action going on. You're going to have to press down on it a little bit harder. So now let me check to see just how much pressure it's going to be generated here. So if I press down on this, it looks like 15. And that means that I probably would need to adjust my pop-off valve here. to be a little bit higher. And that's too high. Or no, that's actually good. I'll leave it at medium. So that way, anything more than this, it'll be vented off. Okay, now, again, the PEEP is supposed to be, if you turn it this way, you should see more PEEP. But you know what? I think this thing is not completely working. We have another one that I can assemble here really quickly because I can't even really see anything happening when I even turn the dial on here. But let me grab the other one out of the bag here. So this one's brand new, so I'm hopeful that this is going to be just fine. So I'm going to adjust my pop-off valve. Right now it's set at high. Or it was actually at the lowest it can go. So I'm going to adjust it so we're in the medium area. Occlude the end of it. And then see. That's a little bit low, so I'm going to go a little bit higher on the pop-off valve. So about, that's a good place, I think, for safety. Now for the PEEP, let's see if the PEEP is working. So right now, hopefully you can see there's no PEEP. I've got my mask completely occluded on the other end. And now I'm going to just dial this in. Okay, and that looks to be about 5 a PEEP. So all you're literally doing is just rotating this dial until you see your baseline of 5 there. And so as we're providing our ventilations with this device, with any of these devices, really, the flow-inflating bag, the self-inflating bag with the mask, it's the same standard procedure as far as how you're going to do your hand placement. Some of these masks are going to be designed for you to just hold it at the top, and the others are going to be hold it around the rim or the edge. But think about your EC method, where you're going to be using your 3 fingers to kind of support the mask, and then press it down on the face, but of course not too hard. The head should be in somewhere between like a neutral position and like a sniffing position, but not too much of a sniffing position because their airways are so soft that just a slight overextension or hyperextension is going to cause it to end up closing. So it's almost like I was saying earlier, like wet noodle. Think about like a wet noodle that is very easy to collapse. So we have them in the neutral position or sniffing position. We've got our seal, and then as we're providing just ventilation at the rate of about 40 to 60 breaths per minute, then you're just touching, and you should see adequate chest rise. So we're doing 40 to 60, so breath 2, 3, breath 2, 3, squeeze 2, 3, squeeze 2, 3, or something of that nature, just to count it out to keep the cadence going. And as you're doing a breath about every 3, then that's going to give you equivalent about 40 to 60 breaths per minute.
Now, let's say that for whatever reason you're not getting good chest rise, or the baby's heart rate is still not increasing like it's supposed to, then they'll always tell you, and they use this acronym all the time in NRP, is to think about the acronym Mr. SOPA, MRSOPA. And that means that you're not going to necessarily have to do all of them at the same time, but do a couple at a time. So the M would stand for the mask adjustment. Maybe your mask is not really in the right position, or maybe you just have to reposition your mask. And then you got to think about the head position. Maybe you've overextended a little bit. And because you've slightly extended or hyperextended, then that could probably be causing the airway to collapse on itself. So then you reposition the head, you check the mask position, and then you continue. And again, you may not still be getting adequate chest rise, or the other person is probably telling you that still the heart rate is dropping or it's too low. Then the S in Mr. SOPA would stand for suction. So then you could take your bulb syringe, and we just have to be careful. We always, suction mouth and then nose. And we don't want to go in too far because that could trigger like a vagal response and cause the heart rate to drop even further. So we want to clear out the oral and then nares if necessary. So that'll take care of the S. And then the O in Mr. SOPA would be make sure his mouth is open. So then as you are applying the mask, you just want to make sure that the mouth isn't closed. And then you continue to try to deliver your breaths. And let's say you're still not getting adequate chest rise, or the other person is telling you the heart rate is still not increasing or still decreasing. So then what that leaves us with P. Maybe you just need to give more pressure. So right now, I have it set to give a pressure, and this is pretty high already. I have it set to give a pressure of 25. Maybe I need to adjust the pressure so that it maybe will be somewhere close to 40, but don't jump from 25 to 40. Do like small increments, like maybe 5. And then in some cases, you may want to go a little bit more, like in increments of 10, but you're not going to go more than 40. So I'm going to switch, I'm going to turn my pop-off valve. I already have it set at medium. So I'm going to go just a little bit higher on that and see how much pressure now is being generated with each breath. So now that's 35. And let's say that that's still not really fixing the problem. Then I may just need to go ahead and intubate. So I got to consider either intubating, in which case you shouldn't have that problem anymore, or some other kind of like adjunct. Like they do make LMAs for newborns, so very, very tiny little LMAs. That's something that you could consider. But either way, that's the Mr. SOPA acronym that's going to help you with troubleshooting any kind of ventilatory problems. Because with babies, if you fix their ventilation, that'll usually take care of the other issues, meaning that they don't have cardiac problems. If they have cardiac problems, it's because it's a ventilatory issue that's causing the cardiac problem to occur. And that's the main reason why we don't do circulation first like we do with the adults. We always start with the airway. The ABC with them is not always going to be ABC, and it's never going to change. Always make sure that you have a proper and patent airway so that you can provide adequate ventilation and oxygenation. And then that will, again, take care of like these heart issues. If they're not getting enough oxygen, they become bradycardic. And if there's some kind of airway obstruction, they're going to become bradycardic. If they're too cold, they're going to become bradycardic. And a lot of times, again, all it really takes is some good ventilation, and then that'll bring everything back to where it should be as far as the cardiac goes. All right, now, So that's the ventilation, and that's the equipment. The only other thing, because we don't really have a working suction regulator, but in some cases, and let me see if I can find the meconium aspirator as well. All right. Now, this ET tube is way too large, but we're going to pretend. So when you're checking all your equipment, your O2, make sure it's working, flow meter, bed is on, it's warming up, the timer on the bed is working, the APGAR timer is working, and suction. You'd also make sure that your suction regulator is working, because sometimes using the bulb syringe is just not going to be enough. You're going to need to use an actual suction catheter, and you'll still follow the same order. You'll clear out the mouth first, and then you could go down the nares and suction. Make sure the regulator is working. Make sure you don't go more than like 100 on that regulator. 80 to 100 is what they would recommend that you set your vacuum pressure to be, and that's in negative numbers, as we know. And then depending on the situation, let's say that, well, for the longest time, what they used to do was they would always suction these babies right before they were fully delivered. Like as soon as the head was delivered, the OB would start suctioning out. You know, they would take a suction catheter usually right there at the bedside and suction out everything. And then they would finish with the delivery, or they would continue to have mom deliver. But then they found that that was unnecessary. And then it could also create problems for them. So meconium is going to be one of those situations where we're concerned that if the baby ended up inhaling some of that meconium, which is basically his poop that he was doing while he was in utero, if that gets into his airways, it's going to create an airway obstruction. And that's going to possibly lead to infection as well, like a really bad pneumonia kind of a situation. So what they would have you do is determine whether or not, first of all, if they tell you that the amniotic fluid is stained, they're saying that there's a lot of meconium that came out with the amniotic fluid. Or if they saw that the vocal cords were stained, like the OB is looking into the mouth and could see that there's like that tint. Instead of like normal white vocal cords, it's like a brownish, greenish kind of color, then they're going to assume that this baby ended up inhaling and aspirating a lot of that meconium, which could be, again, now in the airways and creating problems. So then what they used to do is they would say, well, is the baby really kicking and screaming? And if he is, well, this is what they still do. If he's still kicking and screaming, even though it looks like he probably aspirated some of his meconium, you would still just use your regular bulb syringe to try to get rid of as much as you can. Or maybe you would probably use your 6 French, 8 French, or whatever size suction catheter you're going to need to try to get rid of some of that meconium as well. But let's say that the baby was born and wasn't really doing anything, no breathing, nothing, no muscle tone, nothing. So then what they designed was these little adapters here. They're called meconium aspirators. And these meconium aspirators are essentially like the thumb port on this suction catheter. So somebody came up with the design, which is intubate, and that'll take, of course, care of getting past the vocal cords. So now that you've got the baby intubated, let's pretend that he's intubated. Now connect your meconium aspirator and then connect your suction tubing to the end of the meconium aspirator. And now, as you're pulling the ET tube out, you're applying suction. So this is just a way to suction below the vocal cords, because doing it this way is not going to be that effective. And you're not really going to know where you're going per se. But if you've intubated, then you verify that the ET tube did go past the cords, and then the aspirator is now there so that you could literally suction as you're pulling the ET tube out. So the meconium aspirator has essentially transformed the ET tube into a suction catheter. And that would be done like maybe once or twice, and then you will continue to go on with your next steps as far as resuscitation and CPR. Okay, and I think that's pretty much it for equipment. So I'll probably have a better understanding of camera angle and all this other stuff on Friday, because this is what I'm resorted to, is just using this iPad. And again, for me, I can see everything, at least this little tiny image that it's given me for myself. But for you, it looks to be probably a different story. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? As far as at least the basic equipment. And as you're reading that NRP manual, you'll see what's going on. And again, the rest, if you can come in and connect the dots that way, then it should be a little bit easier. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say this is all we have for today. We have a faculty meeting coming up anyway. And we'll just pick up in the morning with chapter 2. And then we'll take care of the other 2 chapters that were scheduled, which will be 3 and 4.